Anyone else popping in? Okay. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Leave my phone up here so I can see the time. All right. All right. Thanks everyone for coming today to our first Tides and Talks of our fall 2026 season. Sorry for the typo in the newsletter and on the flyer. It is today, August 13th, not September 13th. Um, For those that are new here, Tides and Talks is a community meeting hosted by us, the St. Andrew and St. Joseph Bay's Estuary Program. We have different guest speakers coming in talking about different topics. So if you are online or in the room and you have a topic you would like to hear about, let us know at the end of the meeting. We want to make sure we're bringing in speakers that are of interest to you guys. So any ideas you have, just let us know. Helps us kind of fill the schedule. We try to do about 4 each fall and spring. So today we have our first one for the fall on our Shuck to Shore Oyster Restoration Program. With me, I'm Ryann Rossi. I'm the estuary scientist for St. Andrew and St. Joseph Bay's Estuary Program. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about our Oyster Restoration Program. So first, I just wanted to start with why oysters. So oysters are these reef-forming bivalves. They do a lot of great things like ecosystem services that help keep our bay healthy, clean, and protected. And some of those things that you may be familiar with are they filter water. So they feed on the particulate matter in the water column. And by doing that, they kind of take out phytoplankton, the particulate matter, and then even nutrients and can help clear that water. They also protect against erosion and create habitat. And they do that by, if you look at how this clump of oysters is formed, they all kind of grow together and make these clumps. So they're providing kind of like, I like to kind of think of it as like macro habitat for bigger organisms like fish, right? We always kind of know when you're out fishing, you might want to be near an oyster reef because you're going to see some bigger fish. They provide excellent habitat for a lot of the fish we like to go fishing for. But then when they kind of glue together, they make all these nooks and crannies, and that provides habitat for a lot of little critters. So things like little teeny fish, gobies, blennies, different crustaceans, worms, kind of everything. So it's providing habitat for little teeny things that you may not even think about, to those larger fish that you may be targeting if you're out on your boat on the bay going fishing for the day. And just kind of fun fact that I like to tell anyone, if you've ever been in the water and kind of had your head and your ears in the water near an oyster reef, you can hear a lot of snapping, crackling, and popping. And that's a really good sign of all of the life that is on that reef. So there's shrimp that will make the different sounds, and even fish make different sounds. So hearing all of that noise near that reef is a really good sign that it's providing great, healthy habitat. And then, of course, what's not on here and what I am sure everyone does love about oysters is we can eat them. And so we get that benefit as well. And so cannot not mention that. But just for some of the other ecosystem things that we think about when it comes to oysters, really that water filtration and that protection against erosion and habitat creation. And so I really kind of wanted to start us off with a little background of kind of the oyster status in St. Andrew Bay. And so if you want more information about a couple of these projects I'm going to talk about, we have a one-pager on the table in the back. And these are not projects the Estuary Program is leading. They're projects our partners lead. But one of these is an oyster data gaps project. And the overall goal of this project in particular is to kind of develop an oyster habitat suitability index model. And this really is a model that takes in data and kind of helps restoration and other managers figure out where are suitable habitat to restore our oysters. So where are they going to be most successful? And so what they started doing in 2023, this is the Fish and Wildlife Commission, Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, Molluscan Research Group that leads this effort. So a mouthful. They're great, and they're out of the Apalachicola office. And they had been monitoring 11 stations in Northwest and East Bay to kind of start and collect some new data for that model to really make sure it's reflective of the conditions that the bays are experiencing right now. And two of the pieces of data that they're looking for during that monitoring is spat settlement. And so that's our baby oysters. And so this is demoing just kind of what that looks like. We've got an adult oyster shell, and then juvenile oyster spat are going to settle onto that shell. That's kind of their preferred substrate. They use chemical cues to kind of detect when to settle out of the water column. Really cool and fascinating that it all works out that way. And so they put out little stringers with oyster shell on them to trap essentially those oyster spat and kind of count what is being recruited over time at some of their stations. And then they also take a look at sedimentation. And so they have these sediment traps that they drop out there, and they kind of measure and weigh how much sediment ends up in there. And that's really important because sediment is really bad when it gets onto our reefs and kind of buries those reefs. It prevents the oysters from being able to feed from the water column. And if it's really heavy sedimentation that's not getting moved out and moved off of that reef, it can lead to the death. So a really important component of how oyster reefs are surviving. And so you also need that spat, those baby oysters. If you don't have a population of baby oysters that's coming into the water column to resupply those reefs, then the reefs are not going, they can't live forever without continued oysters settling on them. And so what you're looking at here in this figure is just that recruitment rate, which is really kind of looking at if baby oysters are coming and settling. And so the takeaway here is that West Bay has a bit higher recruitment, so more baby oysters we're finding there than North Bay and East Bay. So potentially maybe a better location for restoring oyster populations if we really want to use the natural oyster population and spat to settle. And so that project is still ongoing. They're wrapping it up. They should be finalizing and done with all of this work at the end of 2026 and early 2027. And we'll also get all of this modeling or sampling that they've done, but the model. So they'll give us what that model looks like for the bay, which will kind of highlight where areas are suitable for oysters. And then they've also done new mapping of the bay system for where oyster reefs are. And so we haven't had updated maps of like where oyster reefs are in quite a long time. So we're really excited to have that data because we don't have a great handle on kind of what the extent or cover of oyster reefs are across all of the bays. So really great data gap filler that we're excited to see the end results of. And then another project that's kind of ongoing and really about to wrap up as well is this project called Florida Oyster Coach Placement Project. Again, that's also on our one pager if you want to grab one on your way out today. Also available online for folks online. And this one is led by the Central Panhandle Aquatic Preserves, and Meg is online. So maybe at the end, Meg, I'll tag you in to see if you have any updates on this one. But very briefly, they go out and monitor these restored reefs. So in this map, it's pretty tiny to see, but those rectangle blocks are all some of the different reefs that they go out and monitor. They pull samples and kind of count and look at oyster density live and dead and things like that. And then from that, you can estimate up to kind of get an average bag, like sack size of oysters that are harvestable. So the harvestable size is 3 inches, so fairly big for an oyster. And kind of the key takeaway here from this figure is that East Bay tends to have more oysters when we look at the results of this project than the other 2 bays. So a bit different when we think about the spat being available, but then this project, I'm just showing results of kind of what the harvestable, so the bigger oysters look like as far as density. And this project is going to wrap up, I believe there's one more effort to monitor and check out these reefs to get an idea of what's going on with the number of oysters on them. And then that will also be wrapped up. So that information is also very helpful to understand how some of these restoration efforts are doing. And then another project that we had is the State of the Watershed. And so we completed this back in 2024. So this is a bit old based on older data. But we took a look at several different metrics to try and put a condition assignment to how oysters are doing in St. Andrew Bay. And again, we're only really considering the bays that have historically had oyster reefs. So for St. Andrew Bay, that's North Bay, West Bay, and East Bay. And so when we look at a metric called oyster mortality, we're kind of assigning the warning sign of caution. There's some signs that we're seeing more survival, but sometimes not to larger sizes like that harvestable size. And then when we look at that harvestable oyster density, so again, has to be 3 inches or bigger to harvest, the density of those is not great with the data that we have for any of the bays. And that is excluding any aquaculture. So this is just natural reefs or restored reefs, nothing aquaculture based. And so we gave that kind of our biggest warning condition because we're not really seeing harvestable size oysters based on the data that we used for this. So that's kind of the status of oysters in St. Andrew Bay. Again, North Bay, West Bay, and East Bay being the focus. And this kind of led to the development of our Shuck to Shore program to kind of help restore oyster populations, create habitat, supplement those existing reefs, fill in some data gaps like what bays might be spat limited. Again, that's the baby oysters, or what bays might be better suited for restoration. And really kind of the 2 prongs of this program that we have right now are an oyster shell recycling program that we've started, and then vertical oyster gardens. And I just wanted to shout out Choctawhatchee Basin Alliance. They have a really great oyster shell recycling program and vertical oyster garden program, and provided a lot of guidance and input and advice as we were developing this. And they're just in our sister watershed over in the Choctawhatchee. And then our partner right now for collecting all of this shell is Hammerhead Fred's out on the beach. So if you've eaten oysters at Hammerhead Fred's, then we probably have your shell laying down in a area in Lynn Haven to be made into vogs or used in restoration. And I would be remiss to not highlight Elisa Schwinn. She is our outreach specialist for the Estuary Program, and she is truly the Shuck to Shore lead. She just happened to be out of town, and I'm simply filling in. So if you have a vertical oyster garden, she has been the one that's been communicating with you. She's been the one that's going out to monitor and things like that. And she's really leading the charge with picking up the shell and making sure it gets to where it needs to go. So just wanted to shout out Elisa and say, I just get to look at the data, but she does most of the heavy lifting for this project. So for oyster shell recycling, we've been collecting shells since about 2024, but we received a grant from the St. Joe Foundation in 2025 to kind of help expand that program. When we first started, we were literally just taking buckets out like you see in these pictures and filling the buckets with shell and then driving them in the back of our truck to the laydown site. So the funding that we've received supports materials to make that shell collection a lot easier, like trailers that we can then wheel garbage bins up onto so that we can actually collect more shell, and then ideally expand to additional restaurants. And so that's kind of the quick status of our oyster shell recycling program. And then we have our vertical oyster gardens. So vertical oyster gardens are cured oyster shell on string, and then they get hung from a dock, and that attracts those baby oysters, and then they kind of grow up into larger oysters like you see in these pictures. So this first picture here, this bog's probably only been deployed for maybe 1 or 2 months, and it's kind of already has some critters on it. And then this next picture, that bog could be deployed for anywhere for 6 months to a year for when we start to really see that good oyster growth. And all of that baby spat that I've been talking about, those baby oysters, this image is kind of showing you what it looks like when a ton of spat settles onto an oyster shell. So for this program, the VOGs, we focus on St. Andrew Bay only, where there's historically been oyster reefs. So St. Joe's not included in this because historically there have not been oyster reefs there. We provide bogs, and then the hosts who have the bogs deployed on their property can monitor, or we can help monitor. It really is up to the host. And so if you have a VOG, we kind of have 3 levels of involvement. Level 1, you set it and forget it. So you get the stuff from us, you hang it up, and then that's it. You don't hear from us again, we don't hear from you. Level 2, we ask you to send us in photos of the VOG every quarter and weight every quarter. And then level 3 is more in-depth monitoring, where we're looking for photos of that VOG. We want to know weights. We want to count the number of oysters that are live and dead on there, the number of spat that you're finding, what other organisms are living on the VOG, and then actually measuring the size of the oysters that are growing there. And that information can really help us kind of pair with some of that previous research work that I was talking about to fill in some of these gaps where we just don't really know if one bay has enough spat or not. Are we seeing oysters get to harvestable size in this bay and not that bay, for example? So that level 3 does really provide us with useful information that we can use to kind of help provide input to our partners and ideally be used in future restoration. And we are always happy to help with whatever level of monitoring that our hosts are interested in, but it is not required. And so we use a Survey 123 to do all of this monitoring. And so that's just a web-based app on your phone that you can do, or an iPad, where all of the information just gets input and then we immediately have it. So not really writing down on paper, just all digital to make it as easy as possible and to not get any data lost is the key for us. So right now we have a total of 92 of our VOGs deployed, and we've given out more than that, but 92 are confirmed in the water. And then we've got 18 people that have those VOGs kind of spread out across the bay, as you can see here in our map. And so I just wanted to highlight some of the gaps that we're seeing based on what we have right now. So the red circle areas are where we'd love to get some additional VOGs in the water. West Bay, we've just really got 2 sites. North Bay, we really just have 1. And I think we got 1 new person within the last few weeks. And then East Bay, kind of past the DuPont Bridge, we were really kind of lacking coverage there as well. So if you know anyone that has waterfront property with a dock that wants to put some VOGs out, send them our way. We would love to get some more data from these areas. And then the rest of the talk, I just kind of want to go over what the monitoring results look like. So a lot of this is, like I mentioned, we have 3 levels of monitoring. So in this report, we're really kind of just focusing on what we have from that level 3, where we have people that are doing all of the nitty-gritty details of monitoring. So these are some of the critters that we're finding on our VOGs. Barnacles, I'm sure we are all very familiar with, as they are very scrapey. Mud crabs, we see tunicates, we see them a lot. They squirt out, they look like brains. We see amphipods, shrimp, little fish like blennies and gobies, and lots of red algae, and specifically. We also tend to see some predators of oysters. And so these are things like oyster drills, flatworms, and other polychaete worms. They can bore and get themselves in between the shell and eat the oyster tissue. And so that's kind of how they're predators of the oysters. And so from our 25-26 monitoring, we see a lot of critters across all of the different locations that we have VOGs. The most common critter that we see are barnacles and then tunicates. We do sometimes have issues with if we deploy a VOG before we have like a good push of baby oysters. Sometimes the shell will get covered with barnacles or covered with tunicates before the oysters can settle or get big enough to outcompete those. So that's something that we've noticed a little bit. We've also had really cool critters like a seahorse one time on a VOG. So we tend to see a lot of different organisms, which has been really fun to see, but hard to identify. And then this is just some more data on the live oysters per year. And so in our first year, the number of oysters that we had was pretty small, under 20 on average. But in our second year, we're seeing a lot more live oysters on those vertical oyster gardens. And some of that is due to we've been monitoring some of these VOGs for over 1 year now. So some of these VOGs are 2 years old. So on average, any of these VOGs that have existed for over a year, we're seeing about 58 oysters on them. So pretty decent and kind of hefty VOGs that are hanging off docks. And I know anecdotally our hosts kind of tell us that they see lots of fish activity around them, especially as they get bigger, and they kind of love having them there. When we look at the sizes of the oysters, so kind of how big that shell is, which is what's used to understand if they're anywhere near harvestable size. And that first year, again, they're not getting to harvestable size in 1 year, based on our data. But over the second year, we're seeing that some of them do. This is showing the average shell height, so how big they are. And East Bay and St. Andrew Bay tend to have a little bit bigger oysters. But again, those ones have been living and collecting oysters for over a year now. We do have some oysters that are like 124 millimeters, so well over that harvestable size. But when we look at the average, we're not really seeing on average close to harvestable size yet. And so one thing that we're particularly interested in are those baby oysters. What are we seeing when it comes to those settling on our VOGs? And so it was very interesting what we saw in our first year. So that's over here in year 24-25. We just saw a huge pulse of settlement of baby oysters in West Bay that we really haven't seen since. As you can see on the figure, that number is just kind of astronomical relative to the others. But in the more recent year, the numbers kind of evened out and are more similar between the bays. And then what we know from some previous work is that we tend to see two pulses of baby oysters in our bays. And it kind of depends per bay segment if that's the fall or the spring, but generally fall and spring is when we tend to see pulses of baby oysters. And you can kind of see that trend here over time on our VOGs. So if we can target when we deploy these empty shell VOGs to before like the fall pulse that we typically see and before the spring pulse that we typically see, we tend to have better yield of oysters on the VOGs. And that makes sense because they're able to get onto the oysters and settle and then grow. And so that's one thing we've been working on to try and kind of more target when those are deployed so that we're making sure we're hitting when baby oysters are peaking and going to be most likely to settle. And that is all I have for our results of that. There's more information, of course, but I didn't want to overwhelm. So kind of our next steps with the Shuck to Shore program is permitting to use these VOGs in oyster restoration and living shoreline projects. So our partners over in Choctawhatchee Bay, the Choctawhatchee Basin Alliance, they're able to they have enough oyster restoration and living shoreline projects that are active and permitted where they can kind of take those grown-up VOGs and place them onto a restoration site that needs it. We just don't really have that set up quite yet, but we're working towards that. And then we plan to identify 1 to 2 new restaurants to collect shell from, and then explore for future partnerships with other organizations. And so with that, I will open up for questions and see if Meg online wants to give an update about the Oyster Culture Project. Okay.
No updates from Oyster Project, hoping to get out to sample again this year, and then she provided a link to the full report, which we can make sure it.
Yeah, we'll push that out. Thanks, Meg. Any questions from the room or online? Yes.
So how do you cure an oyster shell?
Great question. So we get them and they're still like gross from them being eaten with remaining meat in them. And then all you do is really just leave them out in the sun in an area where you aren't worried about the smell impacting other people. Or animals coming and attracting that. So typically you want to do it in an area that's like kind of removed from people in general. And I think the minimum is like 3 months, but we do like a year at least.
And you do that in Lynn Haven?
Yes. So FSU has some property in Lynn Haven near the old fuel depot. And so that's where our laydown is. Yep. So really no one's out there. Yeah.
Full oyster.
Yeah.
Some folks, researchers that were here before, said that it could live out of the water for 12 months.
Really?
Now, I don't know if that just happened to be in what percentage of those, but they said that they had some live out of the water for 12 months.
Yeah.
Because I see them when I walk the shoreline back where I live, you'll see little tiny ones that are on little sticks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're still closed up.
Yeah. If they're closed up, then
that's good.
That's good sign.
They're keeping themselves protected until the tide comes back in, and then they'll filter. But usually if they're just cracked open a little bit, that's when they're feeding. But if they're all the way open, then they're probably dead or dying.
Yeah.
Does the spat stay on the big shell like forever, or when does it fall off? Or because like in restaurants, they've got all the individual little oyster shells. So where are they getting those from? Like, how does that all work?
Like the individual oysters that you're eating? Yeah, they'll start to kind of, I don't remember at what stage it happens. But yes, that one shell that had like 1 million babies on it stay like that.
So on the VOGs that you're creating, there's spat living on there, but eventually they'll fall off and become.
No, they'll just kind of spread. But they'll generally stay, but then like chunks can break off and start a new pocket. So it just kind of depends.
Yeah, the restaurant get all those individual. And then if you look really close at the shell, you could probably see that there's other little oysters on it too. A lot of the times you can't tell because it's dirty or, it's cooked if you get the baked ones. But sometimes you can kind of flip it around and see the outside of little baby spat were on it too. But they've taken that reef section and a lot of times it's the farm. And so the farmed ones,
they keep them
in baskets and they don't really aggregate together into a chunk. And so if it's a farmed oyster, then they're usually individual oysters.
Oh, interesting. Okay. How is that vog created? How do you make those? Like,
So
attach the rope and make them all.
we have one back here we'll show you. But it's just that cured dried oyster shell. You drill a hole in it and then you put them on a string.
Wire.
Mhm.
We didn't want metal because if you have a boat and the boat's in the water, then the metal can have issues with some of the metal in the boat. And so we use the paracord. Obviously we'd love to not have to use something like this and something more biodegradable. It does eventually, but the paracord stays for a while. Like if we use like jute or something, it breaks down too quickly. But we've only had one break
yeah.
off the FSU pier that was almost 3 years old because we deployed those. I counted back; it was about 3 years ago almost, and so it got so heavy it snapped the rope. And then another person had some cut, but it looked more like something happened. The boat got into the wall, into under their dock, and they had to cut them free or something like that. It just was severed completely. So
Wow, so did these have spat on them?
not right now because we haven't deployed them.
So they didn't.
They the little spat usually when you cure them they fall off.
Okay, gotcha.
See.
Yeah, I would be surprised to see
A lot of
any on that shell. Yeah.
See.
Yeah.
Hunt's Oyster Bar has a big trailer out back, which stinks terrible.
Yeah.
Are they gonna be your recycling?
They have a lot of shell, and it kind of depends on where the restaurant is getting the shell from. So some places like Texas require you to send the shell back because they have to put it back on their reef.
Okay.
And so it all depends on what state it's coming from and what their laws are and how they treat their shell. But a lot of restaurants will actually sell it for driveways. So luckily Hammerhead Fred's is okay with us coming and taking some of theirs, but it is potential revenue for them that they're letting us have. So Hunt's, I think, probably sells it. But I don't know.
Revenue.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Those stinky things. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
People are doing that. Decoupage or whatever.
Boy, we'd have a lot to do from Hunt's.
There is a question online.
Yeah. Joy?
Can y'all hear me? Can you hear me, Ryan?
Joy, if you are trying to ask your question, we cannot hear you.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat then.
Your speaker up.
It's on. Try now. Hmm.
Oh,
Okay, can you hear me now?
Oh. Try now, Joy.
Yeah, can y'all hear me? Looks like somebody can hear me. That's okay. I'll put it in the chat. I'll just go ahead and put it.
We got you, Joy.
Oh, okay. All right. Thanks, y'all. Love this. And I love to see that y'all are, partnering with CBA, of course, to take the VOGs over to seed their reefs, while y'all are still working up another process for that. But is there going to be any testing, or is there any concern that there's going to be something on those VOGs that y'all are going to, transplant into Choctawhatchee Bay, or are y'all pretty assured that there's nothing you're going to be transporting on those VOGs over?
So none of our VOGs would be going to Choctawhatchee Bay. I was just giving the example that Choctawhatchee Basin Alliance has a VOG program as well, and their VOGs can be transported to some of their restoration sites in Choctawhatchee.
Oh, I got you. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sorry for misunderstanding.
Nope, that's okay. I think permit-wise, it would be required that the VOGs are coming from the same area for it to go onto a restoration. So in theory, that should not be a concern in general in the VOG world of where they're going. Okay. They shouldn't be mixing water bodies.
Great stuff. Thanks, y'all.
Yeah.
I have a question about the sediment you mentioned
Mhm.
early on.
Mhm.
It's so to keep the sediment away from these, does that depend on water movement or does that depend on water runoff coming from the streets into the?
Both.
Okay.
Both. So there were some times where they might go out to monitor a reef and they would find like heavy sedimentation. And I just remember being with them on one occasion. And then the next time when they went out there, they didn't find that much sedimentation again. So that was probably just the water movement of it. But the source of that sediment is likely runoff and things like that.
Okay, and that keeps the babies from the spat from attaching to the
It can keep
shells.
them from attaching, and then it can kind of almost like smother the bigger oysters from being able to open and feed.
Thank you.
So I have some bogs on my dock that we deployed at the same time as some on the FSU pier. And mine are much smaller, but we are on a canal. And so there's a lot of suspended sediment and mine are very dirty all the time. And so it's a good example of, it really doesn't matter where you're putting these things. Now I still have oyster grove and we have lots of critters, so it's still serving a purpose, but they're not growing anywhere close to how the ones at FSU Panama City's campus are.
Because that's wide open.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
We can put one for my dog.
Great.
Yeah.
We have this technical guy here that's all about details.
Wonderful.
Don't have to know much about it, just measure it and watch it and see what it does.
Yeah. Anything else from folks online? Mhm. Well, I wanted to share our tentative schedule for the rest of tides. So tentatively, we'll have one in September, October, and November. These are the tentative dates. We will be sure to put out a final schedule once we have them locked in. We should be having one presentation on scallops, so that should be a good one.
Is October 8th.
Yep.
Waiting on confirmation for seawalls versus living shorelines on September 10th, but we need to solidify it.
Yeah.
And we can sign you up if you're interested in a vlog in the back, and then we actually have kits that are ready to go.
All right.
Somewhere to put one. I'd do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is all we have for today. If there's any other questions online, shoot them in the chat now. I don't think I see any additional questions.
Well, it was already dead when I did not kill it.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And if you have ideas for speakers, let us know.